Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Romeo and Juliet. This is the last of the scene by scene tutorials. We're going to be having a close look at Act 5, Scene 3, the very end of the play. So let's get started. Our last scene summary for the play, Act 5, Scene 3, opens with Paris outside the Capulet tomb in a churchyard. He's there to lay flowers by the tomb of Juliet and to mourn her. Romeo also appears because, of course, his plan is to break into the tomb to be with Juliet, and Paris is understandably confused as to why he's there and thinks the worst, which leads to them having a little bit of a fight, which ends in Romeo killing Paris. He then enters the tomb only to see, obviously, the love of his life dead in front of him. So he has one sort of final soliloquy. It still counts as a soliloquy because Juliet is asleep, where he talks about death and the way that death is sort of almost like taking Juliet from him as a lover, and the only thing that he can do is to take his own life by taking the poison that he bought from the apothecary, and then dies next to Juliet. Now, she wakes up from her sleep, but before she realises that Romeo is dead, the friar comes in as planned to rescue her. But obviously Romeo is there dead. Now, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but in a strange move on the friar's part, his fear of being caught in this situation means that he actually leaves Juliet and abandons her, leaving her alone in the tomb with her dead lover, which, as you can imagine, means that Juliet fulfills the one thing she's been saying she would do all along if things didn't work out, which is to commit suicide, leaving the two of them together, dead, reunited, hopefully, in heaven. The scene does not end there, though, because obviously there is rumour afoot of what's going on, and most of the people left in the play gather along with the watch, and the prince arrives as well. The Capulets are there. Lord Montague is there. It's mentioned very briefly that Lord Montague's wife, Lady Montague, has died from grief, that Romeo's exile was the reason for her death. It happens very, very quickly. And the prince basically looks out on everything. He asks the friar to explain, the friar who has been sort of arrested by this point by the watch, asks the friar to explain what has gone on. And the friar, there's a very, very long speech where the friar just quite verbatim explains everything that happened with the exception of his motivations. And the prince pronounces that all are punished. He goes on to say that some will be specifically pardoned and some will be punished, but the idea is that regardless of whether or not a person is going to be, made responsible, everyone has lost, everyone has suffered, and that is a point of the feud. And then at the very end of the play, the Capulets and the Montagues appear to be united, where they recognise what they have lost and shake hands, and seemingly it is the end of the feud, but at what a massive loss. So let's go back to the very beginning of the scene and have a little look at this opening skirmish between Paris and Romeo. It's quite interesting to compare these two characters, these two lovers of Juliet in this moment. Paris arrives on scene first with his page, and he is here, as I said before, mourning Juliet. Look at the way that he addresses her. It's very, very reminiscent of the language used by both him and Capulet in the previous act when Juliet was found dead. Sweet flower, with flowers thy bridal bed I strew. So again, we've got this metaphor of Juliet being a flower. Note this idea about her sweetness again. And we've got this echo of the idea that Juliet, rather than marrying him, has married death, because it's her bridal bed that he is putting flowers to, even though obviously her bed is her tomb. He promises that he will be there every night, watering those flowers with his tears. We've got a lot of hyperbole here, tears and potentially his moans as well. So it's quite a sort of solemn promise of mourning. Some people question whether or not this is a kind of genuine response. I think it is possible because he is alone, aside from his page, perhaps it is genuine. But when you look at it perhaps in comparison to Romeo and see Romeo's grief, perhaps the sort of falsity of Paris is highlighted, whether he means to or not, but you just can't help when you compare it with Romeo. Romeo says, "Thou detestable Moor, thou womb of death, gorged with the dearest morsel of the earth." So he is addressing the tomb itself with these metaphors. Moor means stomach, so he's calling the tomb a stomach, a detestable stomach, and a womb of death. Note the antithesis here, this juxtaposition in this metaphor, womb obviously being a bringer of life, but in this case it is death. And because he's used this metaphor of a stomach, that is extended with this idea of the stomach sort of ravenously eating up Juliet, gorged with the dearest morsel of the earth. Note the superlative here in dearest. There is nothing more special than Juliet. And so if you just look at the difference in terms of the language itself, this is very kind of typical language of grief. It's a sort of acceptable language of grief, whereas the emotive nature of Romeo's choices here demonstrate his extraordinary pain, perhaps also his tendency to go in a world of melodrama as well, but certainly that grief does seem more genuine, especially when what Paris is promising is to come at night and weep, whereas Romeo is saying that he will force the rotten jaws open. So again, we're talking in metaphor. It's about opening the tomb doors, but it's extending this idea of it being like not just a stomach, but almost like a beast. And he is going to cram thee with more food, i.e. he is the food. It's another reference to the fact that he is going to commit suicide, that he is going to be with Juliet, force the tomb to eat more. When Paris hears and sees that it is Romeo, his mind leaps to quite sort of suspicious conclusions. He says, "This is that banished, haughty Montague that murdered my love's cousin." So this is, you know, this haughty Montague, superior Romeo, who murdered Tybalt. With which grief it is supposed the fair creature died. Okay, you can understand why he would leap to that. He doesn't know anything else, so he's thinking that the grief of Tybalt's death is what has killed Juliet. And so you can understand where some of that rage comes from and his desire to fight Romeo, because he is blaming Romeo for Juliet's death. This is perhaps a little tenuous, and here has come to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies. Now that's a little bit of a leap, the idea that Romeo is there in some way to disrespect or do something horrible to the bodies of Juliet and Tybalt. It's unlikely, but perhaps his grief has driven him to that kind of paranoia. But again, compare this to Romeo. Romeo, who when he sees Paris and when he sees Paris wishes to fight him, he says, "Put not another sin upon my head by urging me to fury. Oh, be gone. By heaven, I love thee better than myself." So he's actually trying to de-escalate the situation, despite the fact that Juliet's death, what he believes to be Juliet's death, has made him furiously angry and temperamental and even more impulsive. I was about to say impulsive, but even more impulsive, faced with fighting a man that he has no issue with. He tries to actually stop the situation. So he hasn't completely lost his Romeo goodness here in this moment. And he says, using imperatives, "Stay not, be gone, live, and hereafter say a madman's mercy bade thee run away." So he really does give Paris opportunity to leave. So I don't think we fully blame Romeo for Paris's death, when of course they fight, and in the end it is Romeo that wins. And this is the soliloquy that is delivered by Romeo to Juliet as she's lying seemingly dead in front of him. he says, "Oh, my love, my wife." So starting with these exclamatives that suggest his kind of horror, his disbelief. And then we move into this personification of death that is reiterated a number of times through the soliloquy. He says, "Death that hath sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power upon thy beauty." So again, it's a continuation of this idea of her being like a flower or a morsel, and that death has taken that kind of sweetness away. But there's also something here that suggests a kind of battle for ownership. He says, "Thou art not conquered." So you haven't yet been won. So slightly problematic or confusing. He says, "Beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks." Now, this is a metaphor here. Ensign means flag. So he's saying beauty's flag has sort of continues to stake claim, is still there in your face. So there's this real kind of focus on beauty. Is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advanced there. So think about this in terms of like exploring and discovering. When you explore and you discover a new place and you take it for your own, you put a flag in it. This is what I mean about the sense of ownership. So this is about who owns Juliet in this moment, and he says death hasn't quite got you. And the reason that he's saying that is because she still looks beautiful. He speaks here to Tybalt in this moment. "Tybalt, liest thou there in thy bloody sheet?" And eventually asks for forgiveness. "Forgive me, cousin." And note the way that he uses cousin, because of course it's a reminder that Tybalt is now kin because of his marriage to Juliet. We have another rhetorical question that focuses on beauty once more, this disbelief in Juliet's beauty. "Ah, dear Juliet, why art thou yet so fair?" So again, this sort of sense of how is it that even when dead, you are still so beautiful. "Shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that the leaner borrowed monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour?" So we've got an extension of this idea, of this metaphor or personification of death owning Juliet or taking Juliet. And here he talks about death as a lover. So there's almost like this kind of sense that he is jealous of death in this moment. So the words amorous there meaning loving, paramour means lover. And so he is sort of saying, well, what if death wants you for himself? And that's why he's got you here. And for that reason, I will stay with thee. So there's this almost like battle in terms of ownership here. "And never from this palace of dim night depart again. Here will I remain with worms that are thy chambermaids." Another metaphor here again about this idea about him staying forever in a place where, and it's using like the idea of worms being chambermaids. It's the only kind of company that Juliet has other than him. "Here will I set up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh." Now here we're back to this idea of fate. Previously he had shouted up, "Then I defy you stars." This idea that he is challenging fate by coming back to Verona to be with Juliet. And here again, when he says shake the yoke, yoke in this case means like the restraints. So he is imagining fate sort of, or the stars, sort of restraining them to try and keep them apart. And he's saying, no, I'm going to shake that away so I can be together. Same irony as previous. If he wasn't trying to defy the stars right now and had a little bit more patience, Juliet would wake up before he actually went and committed suicide, but then it wouldn't be a tragedy. "Eyes look your last, arm takes your last embrace, and lips, O you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death." So here we've got this personification of all of the different parts of his body, and he's instructing them of what to do, the last things, the last kiss, the last embrace. So it's his final moments where the body is sort of doing its last kind of romantic acts of love, because he is going to say farewell to his body, and it will be his soul that is reunited with Juliet. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavoury guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick, weary bark. So we've got a metaphor here of journeys, this idea of life being a journey. And again, we're being reminded of the idea of it being sort of out of his control. It might remind you of the very end of Act 1, Scene 4, just before they go to the Capulet party, after the Queen Mab speech, right at the end, where he says, but he that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail. He has this moment of misgiving, of fear about what events are sort of being set in motion. Then he says, okay, whatever will be, will be. This is like the end of that metaphor. The journey is coming to an end, and now at once run on the dashing rocks. So it's almost like the boat has crashed into rocks as he comes to this tragic end. And it's at this moment that he toasts his love with his poison, here's to my love, and takes his life. When Juliet awakes, unlike some productions, a lot of productions skip this bit and just have Juliet waking up and finding Romeo. But the play itself has a moment where Friar Lawrence actually does come to sort of help Juliet along with Balthazar. Balthazar explains what's going on. So Friar Lawrence comes in. I hear some noise. Lady, come from that nest of death, contagion, and unnatural sleep. So we've got metaphor, we've got triad here, death, contagion, and sleep. Contagion, sorry. And so he's trying to kind of whoosh her out. He also talks about fate. He says a greater power than we can contradict has thwarted our intents. So he blames fate. He doesn't blame himself. He doesn't seem to show to Juliet anyway any responsibility here. It's not his fault, it's fate. Okay, you can agree with that. It's not his fault that the plague took out one of his other friars who's meant to be delivering the letter. But again, it does sort of remove him. Okay, so what is the possibilities for Juliet according to the friar? Come, I'll dispose of thee amongst a sisterhood of holy nuns. Oh, great, how lovely. So her husband is dead, her potential betrothed future husband is dead, and what will the friar do to help her out? Chuck her in with a bunch of nuns. Check out the verb dispose. Anyone get the feeling that Friar Lawrence is sort of trying to wash his hands of this, or actually this is becoming a little bit of an inconvenience to the friar? Well, if you think I'm being harsh, stay not to question, for the watch is coming. Come, go, good Juliet. When Juliet does not immediately rise from her bed, he says, I dare no longer stay. Why? Why doesn't he dare stay with Juliet in this moment? It's because he is frightened. He's frightened of getting caught. At this moment, Friar Lawrence, the holy man, abandons Juliet and runs away, leaving her in the tomb. So again, coming back to the friar's motivations, even if his motivations were pure, his actions, when everything has gone kaplooey, are not. Juliet said from word go that if it didn't work, she would commit suicide. That was always the option that she had in the back of her mind. And now Romeo is dead, the friar has left her. And what is left? What's here? A cup closed in my true love's hand? Poison, I see, hath been his timeless end. So it's, in some ways, it's very much a kind of typical Juliet reaction. It's kind of pragmatic, it's observant, it's looking around at what's happening. Oh, tell. She's referring to Romeo there, but I don't think she means it in a particularly negative way. It's more the frustration that he's done this without her. Drunk all and left no friendly drop to help me after. Note the personification of the poison being friendly here. I will kiss thy lips. Haply some poison yet doth hang on them to make die with a restorative. This is a metaphor here because a restorative is medicine. It's also an ironic metaphor because obviously poison is being described as something that can cure. But in her world, the disease is life because that is what life is without Romeo. Hence the poison becomes the cure. She kisses him. There's not any poison left on his lips. which is when she sees the dagger. And then we have this personification of the dagger, which echoes the friendly poison. We have "Oh happy dagger." It's obviously juxtaposition as well. "This is thy sheath, their rust, and let me die." Some productions say it should be "their rest and let me die" rather than "their rust and let me die." If it's "their rest," then it's a kind of echo of this idea that death will give her peace. If it's "their rust," then it's about the longevity of death, because obviously things rust over time. Either way, it works. And this obviously results in Romeo and Juliet left dead together. I've titled this next slide "The Aftermath" because there is now on the stage a real sort of bustle and chaotic tone as all of the other characters, the watch and the families, come together back on stage. Again, not always presented in production. Some people sort of just leave it with Romeo and Juliet and a couple of parting words from the prince. I'm not going to go through the friar's speech, but it is worth having a little look at later on. But it's very much a kind of blow by blow of everything that has happened, which is another reason that sometimes it's cut, because some people just don't think it's as needed. But let's look at what the prince says. "See what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love." So the prince sees this really as a punishment. Okay, you've got really emotive language there, scourge and hate, and then the personification of heaven, heaven finding means or finding ways to kill your joy with love. Obviously referencing the love of Romeo and Juliet there. And he blames himself as well. He says, "And I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinsmen." So winking at your discords means sort of like letting things slide, like not taking enough action of their feuding. And so he has lost people. And then note the kind of bluntness of this declarative. All are punished. That's the bleak reality. Everyone is punished regardless of what happens next, because Romeo and Juliet and Paris are dead. Now, in this section here, you seem to have this kind of reuniting of the Montagues and the Capulets. So look, straight away, we've got, "Oh, brother Montague," so that kind of familial bond. "Give me thy hand. This is my daughter's jointure, for no more can I demand." The jointure is it's like the dowry, the money that comes with a bride. So in this case, he's sort of referring to Romeo and Juliet as being married and saying this is the settlement, this is what would have come. And Capulet, and Montague extends it and says, "Oh, but I can give thee more. I will raise her statue in pure gold, that while Verona by that name is known, that there shall no figure at such rate be set as that of true and faithful Juliet." So he's like, "No, hang that. I'm going to raise a statue made of gold." And Capulet's, "Oh yes, rich shall Romeo's by his ladies lie." So yeah, I'll build one of Romeo as well, and we'll put them together. So it all looks like, oh well, they've died, but at least the feud's over, which is what was promised in the prologue. Despite this, the prince refers to this piece as a glooming piece. It is a piece full of sorrow. Yes, of course, it's a piece that has come about through Romeo and Juliet's death. So, of course, it's a glooming piece. However, there are some people that wonder if it's also a glooming piece because it's unlikely that this alliance between the Capulets and Montagues will last. Yes, the feud seems to be over, but some people read that previous exchange between Montague and Capulet as one-upmanship. I'll do this. Well, no, I'll create a statue. Well, I'll create a statue as well. Note that their statue's made of gold, another kind of expression of wealth. So it is possible here that the prince is kind of referencing this. That's for you to decide. He personifies the sun, saying the sun for sorrow will not show his head. There's a sort of sense of shame here in what has happened to these two young people. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished. It's got that nice juxtaposition between pardoned and punished, and the kind of ambiguity or the vague language, excuse me, in that kind of indefinite pronoun some. You know, we're not sure who is being held responsible here, but the prince is clearly going to decide. And then our final rhyming couplet of the entire play: for never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. So the last lines of the play come straight back to love and to Romeo and Juliet's love and the tragedy of their story. And that is it from me. Obviously there are themes to kind of make reference to, clearly the theme of death, the theme of consequence and responsibility, love and conflict as always, and then the biggie, fate. This isn't the end of YouTube videos on Romeo and Juliet, because I will be making a selection of videos on key themes and specific characters, just to help you revise for those kind of wider essays that you'll get in your exam. So if you've got any requests or if you've got any questions about this final scene, then do drop me a line in the comment section and I will get back to you. If you haven't subscribed, I'd really appreciate it. Do click that button or the smiley face of me that appears on the screen, so that you can get notifications, and you can find out about all of the other videos that I am making to help you with your study of English literature and language. Thank you so much for watching. Happy revising.